Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You got us yet? Yeah. Okay. I gave you another handout this morning on chapter 3. I don't know that we'll get to it today, probably not. But if we do, we do. If we don't, we don't. But keep it till next week. And we'll see, because chapter 3 is one of the key chapters in Exodus. There's some really, really important things in the section after the one that I gave you this morning. It doesn't cover all of chapter 3, just the first 12 verses. So there'll be another one on chapter 3 later. But anyway, we were in chapter 2 last week. We just gotten into it, and we were talking about the birth of Moses and getting into some of those things. But let me just read the first 10 verses of chapter 2 for you first. It said, and a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes, when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. And while he was in the river, a crocodile came up and ate him. Just wanted to see if you were listening. I used to do that to my children, and I would read them. They had books that they would read, and they knew the stories, and I would just change something in the middle of it. Yeah, that's not what it says. No, there was no crocodile. This section of the river down there, most scholars say that at that time the crocodiles weren't there. They were in the upper part of the Nile, but not that part, at least not commonly. Anyway, there was no crocodile. And so then the daughter of the Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, that's Moses' sister, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And so she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning of God's plan and preparation with Moses particularly as he is born. And we're going to see all through these next few chapters how the Lord is preparing Moses for the great task that lay before him. And we're going to see in chapter 3 and 4, Moses tries to get God to change his mind about sending him down there. I think there are 5 different objections that he sees, but we're going to look at all that. But Moses is being prepared, and he's a baby. His mother puts him in the little boat made out of rushes, made out of the plants that grew in the water there, and it naturally floated. And she sealed it all up, got it all ready, put him in it, and I think we got through that part of this last week. And so the daughter of Pharaoh, who was a princess, she would have been a very high-ranking person in the Egyptian empire of that time. And we're talking about somewhere down in this area of the Nile, if you can see I don't know if all of you can see it from over there, but somewhere down in this portion of the Nile. River. And as I was talking about the crocodiles, they were up in this area, in this part of the Nile. Lots of them, all the way down deep into Africa. But they were somewhere up in this area. So Pharaoh's daughter, with her maids, she's down by the river, she's bathing. And I remember saying to you last week that this was probably a ritual bath of some sort. There were ablutions and things that people often went through as part of the Egyptian religion, and they considered the Nile a very sacred thing. So it may have been that she was doing a religious thing, maybe not just simply taking a bath, but she might have been taking a bath too. But I would have been surprised if she had been doing that in the Nile. But anyway, it says that she was taking a bath and that she was at the Nile and saw the baby opened up the ark, and there's the baby. And isn't it an interesting touch that the baby wept? It says, and so she took compassion on it, felt sorry for it. She realized it immediately that this child was one of the Hebrews' children, probably from the cloth that it was wrapped in, maybe the construction of the little ark, who knows. But almost certainly the cloth that it would have been wrapped in would have been a Hebrew pattern of some sort. And she recognized it, at least that it wasn't Egyptian. She would have known what her father commanded about destroying the children of the Israelites as well. She would have known all about that, being in the hierarchy of the empire, and her father being the Pharaoh. So she would have known that kind of an order, and she would have known that this child was put there to save it against the orders of Pharaoh. And yet she seems to be a compassionate woman, and she takes care of it. And so and remember that Moses' sister Miriam is standing there watching all this, and when the Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby, she goes over, apparently sees it, and goes over to her and offers to get a wet nurse for the baby. I find this very interesting, that the sequence of events in which the Lord uses Moses' own sister, and then his sister goes and gets his mother to be his wet nurse, and then the daughter of Pharaoh is going to pay her wages to take care of her own baby. So this is a really neat deal for her, to save the baby in the first place, and then to be paid to take care of your own child. Of course, Pharaoh's daughter doesn't know that this is the mother. I would say not from the context. It doesn't indicate that at all. But she took the child and she nursed him. And then in verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Now there's time lapse in here. We're not told much about the detail, but there's some time going on here before this took place, and how long we don't know. But the child was growing, maybe big enough to start to eat on its own, to be weaned. Who knows? We don't know those kind of details, but anyway, the child grew to some age, and Miriam brought him, or the mother apparently, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, because she was paying for the child all this time, and he became her son. So it was an adoption. All right. Now, if you remember seeing the movie The Ten Commandments, Moses in the Ten Commandments was raised as Pharaoh's daughter and was treated like a prince as well, which is probably pretty accurate. I mean, it's guesswork, but still, or speculation, but it's still very likely that he would have been raised in this family as a prince was raised, with all of the benefits that went with that, including education, food, the training, the military training that he would have been given, and he became her son. And then it tells us that she gave him a name, and she called him Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now that is an interesting reason for calling him Moses, because the word for Moses sounds like the Hebrew word for draw out. But when scholars look at this, I don't know how much most of us know about Egyptian history. I know about this much, but that may be more than what some of you may know, because most of us don't study much about Egyptian history, and you have there's all of these Egyptian names like Thutmose, Amos, Ramos, with M-O-S-E on the end of them. A very common Egyptian name, or part of the name. And so a lot of the scholars think that Moses is actually an Egyptian name, but it does sound like, for the Hebrews, it sounded like to be drawn out because she drew him out of the water. So who knows where the name came from, but it is believed that Moses is actually an Egyptian name. And that's the name she gave him because she was taking him into her household, adopting him as her son. Okay, so it's a beautiful story, I think, of God's provision as he continues to provide for the raising of this particular child and protecting this child. And remember that at this time, all of the Hebrew boys that could be killed were being killed by the Egyptians. They were trying to eradicate the male children, and so that's going on while this is going on. So the Lord makes all of this provision to spare Moses and to give him life when many around him were not surviving. So we are grateful to Pharaoh's daughter. Comments on this little section? It's not difficult to follow and to understand. Yes, Marty?
Not really a scriptural thing, just I guess a little trivial thing. And maybe I'm the only person that didn't know this, but in the movie The Ten Commandments, I just found this out a few weeks ago that the baby was actually Charlton Heston's grandson.
Oh.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I thought that was kind of cool.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Well, I really love that movie when I first saw that. And I've always been interested in ancient history, and not particularly Egyptian history, but more Roman and Greek. But it was interesting, and I always remember Yul Brynner. So let it be written, so let it be done. You know.
I love that movie.
And he was he looked like an Egyptian, what you might think an Egyptian would look like. They were a very powerful people at this point in history. And so I think it was a bit risky what Pharaoh's daughter did, actually, because she was going against the decree of Pharaoh. She knew this was a Hebrew child. Obviously, when Miriam comes up to her, she knows it absolutely. And then the mother is a Hebrew woman too, and she just had to have known that she was actually disobeying the decree of her father. So let it be written. Well, it's not going to be done in this particular case, and so Moses is spared. And so we jump all the way from him being a little tiny baby in the river, maybe a few years, he's weaned, brought to Pharaoh's daughter. That's speculation on my part now that he was weaned, but it seems it would make good sense. So it may have been a year or two, but who knows. But at verse 11, there's a big time gap there, because it says, now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Doesn't tell us how old he is at this point. We have some hints that we'll look at a little bit later, but more than hints from the New Testament, that he went out to his brethren. So by this time, he's grown, he's been trained, he's probably been trained as a soldier. He's certainly been trained to read and to write in the manner of the Egyptians and their hieroglyphics and all that. And he would have been trained in politics and governing and all of those kinds of things if he got the typical education of an Egyptian prince at that time. Because they had a very rigid training system for those that were the sons of the Pharaoh, because someday some of them would become pharaohs, and they would be ruling the empire and directing the army and in control of the economy and everything that was involved in it. So they would have had to been trained to deal with all that kind of thing. And so it came to pass, he was grown, he's a grown man now. It doesn't tell us how old he is again, but to call him a grown man, he would probably been in his, somewhere in his 30s, maybe, to be called a grown man like that. Anyway, he went out to his brethren. Interesting that the Egyptians aren't his brethren. He goes out to the Hebrews, who are his brethren. So it becomes obvious in the course of events here that he knows that he is not an Egyptian. How did he know that, do you suppose?
His mother. That's my guess.
I'm gonna get a stick and thump him on that. No, I
I was
wouldn't.
gonna say, by the way, his features, what I was thinking.
Maybe. Yeah. But I think the pastor's probably right.
Yeah.
Miriam is there, the mother is there, and where do you think he was during a lot of that time? She was there with him, the sister was there, probably others in the family that he would met, and he probably learned to speak Hebrew before he learned to speak Egyptian. You think about that, because the mother's not likely to have spoken Egyptian or not well, but so what is she going to teach him? This is the period in which not only was Moses getting a education from the Egyptians, but it's very likely also that his mother, his sisters, his family were teaching him about his own history, his own people. You know, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and all of that, telling him, all that. So I think Pastor's right that it was from his own mother that he learned who he was and what his people said. Raylene?
I appreciate what Nancy said, but Joseph, when he was down in Egypt, his brothers certainly didn't recognize him because he was
They did not.
manicured like an Egyptian.
Yeah.
And you would think that they would do that to Moses.
Yeah. Physically, the Egyptians and the Canaanites, the people from that area, the Semites, the people from those areas, they physically looked a lot alike. They were not physically all that different from each other. It was very possible for one to imitate the others, and it just wasn't so obvious physically. If you live in a country where there are lots of, in Nigeria, the tribes, even though for us they all are black people and they all look similar, but they can tell by looking at a person, and I'm not talking about clothing, I'm just talking about the physical features of what tribe they are likely from. Now, not every time, but most of the time. And so that's true with Japanese and Chinese and other Orientals. They can tell what country they're from simply by looking at the physical features, even though they might be dressed alike. So Moses knew, but it's very likely that he knew his own family history from his mother, who was teaching him. Now, that would have been a tricky thing, wouldn't it? As she trained him as a Hebrew, but he was also in this training as a daughter of Pharaoh, as a prince of Egypt. Would have been a series of training. So she would have had to been careful when he was younger, but of course after he became old enough to understand, he would know that he had to be very careful in what he said. But at this point anyway, at verse 11, he knows that when he goes out among these slaves that are working as slaves and doing all this building and stuff, that they are his brethren. It seems he knows that. That's why he ends up killing the Egyptians. Somebody had their hand up over here. Yeah, Arlene.
Well, I think maybe the way they private as far as Moses was concerned, but I
Yes.
believe that all of those teachings, he didn't worship what the Egyptians worshiped. He didn't learn to in the home. And so therefore he was, and all their mannerisms and the way they lived was different than the Egyptian would live.
Yes, it would have been very different, very different. But he learned both, it appears that he learned both systems. The traditions of his own family. Now, do remember, we're in the early stages of the Old Testament still. There isn't a great deal, if anything, written. There may have been, there probably were writings that told the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, but we really don't have any scriptural writings, any full writings until Moses writes Genesis. So at this point, Moses hadn't written Genesis, so there wasn't a great deal of history and so on to learn compared to what there might become later. But Moses is being trained orally, probably mostly, from his mother and his other family members, likely, and also in the lore of the Egyptians and their way of life, which would become a great advantage later when he becomes the leader of the Hebrew people and he goes to Pharaoh. He knows the court stuff, and it's not made a big deal of, but he would have known a great deal about their gods and things. It may have been why the plagues were what they were at the time. Did somebody else have a hand up? I'm sorry. I don't want to. Laura, you didn't have your hand up, did you? Okay. Well, anyway, so he goes out to see his brethren and looked at their burdens. Now, the Lord has already talked about, the enslavement that the Egyptians have done, and Pharaoh is making it harder and harder and harder, the Pharaohs, during this time in Egypt, and it's getting worse, and it's gotten a lot worse just recently. That's why Moses was being hidden and that kind of thing, of course. But the slavery and the burdensome work that they were being called to do, to make bricks without straw and those kinds of things that took place, those were really difficult things, and it was very demanding physical work, and probably led to a lot of people dying very young, and so on. So Moses goes out, and it says he looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. They emphasize that twice in this one verse. And Moses went out to visit his brethren, and Hebrew specifically says here, one of his brethren. So he knows that the Hebrew people are biologically his ancestors. Now, what he felt for the Egyptian princes, what he felt for the Egyptians, we're not told. We need to always remember when we're reading Scripture, especially that Scripture only tells us what we need to know. One of the reasons for that, one of the very good reasons for that writing in those days was extremely difficult. Keeping records was extremely difficult. So when this story was written out, vast things that we might like to question about and raise questions about are not there, because they're not really key to what the story is. What is written here in Exodus is written for our purposes, for the Lord's purposes with his people. And all of the details that we would like to ask questions about, what was that princess's name? What were the Pharaoh's names? What were all of those kinds of things? What did Moses do when he was in that school and going? What happened in between those years, from the time he's an infant virtually to the time he's now a young man old enough to go out and kill somebody? What happened in all that? We're not told. We don't need to know that. It would be nice to know that. Maybe someday we can ask Moses face to face what happened during that time. I suspect that the Lord's got a really huge library of videotapes that we'll be able to go watch. And we'll see the Ten Commandments Part 2, or the second, the real edition of that, and see that, I suppose. But we're not told. We don't need to know, but it's interesting to speculate a little at points, but we don't want to overdo that either. So it says in verse 12, he looked this way and that. You can imagine this. He sees this Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Now, was it beating him to death? Just beating him? What? We don't know. Again, we could ask that question, but there's no answer. But he was beating him. It was enough that it aroused Moses' anger. And so it says that he looked this way and that. You can imagine that. Is there anybody watching? There were people watching. He didn't see him, apparently. We know that from what happened. But he looked this way and that, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. A murder. Moses is guilty of murder. He would not have had that right as an Egyptian to kill another Egyptian like that. Now, the pharaohs had absolute power, but Moses wasn't the pharaoh. Moses was a prince, and this would have been considered a murder. And remember, we don't know really if Pharaoh or other officials knew whether Moses was actually Pharaoh's daughter's son. Probably it was pretty well known that he wasn't, that he was an adopted child, but we don't know. But at any rate, he kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand, literally covering up his crime, and he went out the second day. We don't know if this was the next day, but another time. He went out another time, and he sees two Hebrew men this time that are fighting. We don't know what they were fighting about, but they were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, now, obviously Moses knew because he knew which one of them was in the right, but we're not told here. And so he says to them, why are you striking your companion? All right, so this introduces Moses is caught now. I mean, the gig is up for Moses. They know, the Hebrews know that, as we're going to look in the next line there, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill us, kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So they were, the slaves were watching. They saw what happened. It was widespread enough, the word went out widespread enough that this Egyptian knew what Moses had done. Maybe he was one that was there and he saw him himself. We don't know that either. You see all the holes in this that we would like to ask questions, but we're told the main storyline of the story, and the question, are you going to kill me too? Well, now Moses knows that it's known what he did. Who made you a prince and judge? That's a little interesting that those two words are, it's not uncommon in the ancient languages, put those two things together. It's what they call in Greek hendiades. It means the two things are one thing. They're made to written separately, but they're two things: a prince and a judge. The prince is a judge, and the judge is a prince in this situation. And so the Hebrew asks Moses, "Who put you in that position over us, that you can act like a prince?" Well, he is a prince to some extent, at least, being the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. But who knows if the Hebrews even know that? But they do know that, or this one at least knows that Moses killed an Egyptian and buried him in the sand. And so he challenges him. Are you going to kill me as well? And so it says at the end of verse 14 there, so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Well, now Moses is in a pickle. Because if the Hebrews know, it won't be too long before somebody's gonna be a rat and tell the Egyptians that he killed this other Egyptian, I would think. And that's a little speculation, but it had become known, and it says in the very next verse that when Pharaoh heard of this matter, which is not surprising, you know, you can expect that all of these Hebrews that knew about this were going to be talking about it. Did you see what that son of Pharaoh's daughter did? He killed one of his own people. From their perspective, Hebrew perspective. He killed an Egyptian and he buried him. And you would have thought maybe there might have been some gratitude on this guy's part that they've been beating them, and mistreating them and abusing them as slaves, and yet there's no gratitude at all. He just blames Moses, and Moses was afraid, and he knew that it was known. And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. I find that a little bit interesting. Moses had no legal authority to do what he did, and this is a murder, because he had killed an Egyptian. If he killed one of the slaves, nobody would have cared. But to kill another Egyptian, and this Egyptian was undoubtedly an overseer of a little bit of rank, and this just wasn't something that he had the right to do, and when he did. Now, that also makes me suspicious that Pharaoh knew who Moses was really. Makes me suspicious that he would have known that, because he is ready to kill Moses. Now, Pharaoh had absolute control over things, and he could do what he wanted to do. He could order an execution anytime that he wanted to, of anybody, Egyptian or slave or whatever. But he sought to kill Moses, so it appears that he may have known Moses' background. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. All right, now he's apparently facing Pharaoh. Fled from the face of Pharaoh, from in front of Pharaoh, and he flees, and all of a sudden, Moses is up here somewhere in Egypt, and now he's in Midian. So that's a long way in those days on foot, and this is really, really difficult terrain to walk over, this whole Sinai desert. This was desert now, and it was desert then. And he flees, and he goes all the way to Midian. Now, Midian is shown to be over here in what is today Saudi Arabia. But it is also believed that the Midianites also may have been on the eastern shore here to some extent. So where exactly he went is not made clear by the word Midian, but it's over in this area somewhere. Way afar from when Moses fled. He really fled. How he fled, we don't know. Got on a chariot, horse, walked, we don't know. But he fled. Okay? And he dwelt in the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. Boy, is that cutting off all the story right there.
Yeah.
I mean, all the stuff that you'd like to know or ask. You know, this isn't a novel. This is a God's word, and it's telling us what we need to know. He goes from Egypt to Midian. And now the story picks up there. Okay? So he sat down by a well. That's not surprising. You know, this area is very dry, arid, desert country. There were wells, there were springs in various places, and those springs would have been well known to people that traveled in that area. So he sits down by a well. Yes, Bill.
Who was in control of Midian at that time? Do we know?
No. Jethro had flocks there. That's what we know. No, there's a lot of these countries. You're going to see in chapter 3 a list of not all of them, but some of the peoples that were in Canaan: the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and all the other ites. And we know virtually nothing about most of those peoples. Almost nothing. of any of their history, names and so on. There's some of it